The words hit Maria Townsend like a fist to the chest. She had been reaching for the door handle of the Hargrove General Store, her fingers just grazing the sun-warmed wood, when she heard his voice drift through the cracked window beside her. Low, certain, carrying the kind of quiet conviction that Andrew Easton never wasted on empty talk. She froze. The afternoon sun of Redstone Valley beat down on the back of her neck, and the dry July wind pushed dust across the boardwalk at her feet, but she could not move a single inch. "I am telling you, Walt," Andrew was saying inside the store, his voice unhurried and steady as a river stone, "that woman is the bravest soul in this entire valley. Man or woman, I do not care what category you put it in. Maria Townsend is the bravest human being I have ever had the privilege of knowing." There was a pause, the scrape of a boot heel on the plank floor, then old Walt Hargrove's gravelly chuckle. "That's so. You sweet on her, Andrew." Another pause, longer this time. Maria's hand fell away from the door. Her knees, which had survived blizzards and drought, and a runaway buckboard that nearly killed her last spring, decided at that precise moment that they had had enough. She found the nearest barrel on the boardwalk and sat down hard, her skirts pooling around her, one hand pressed flat against her sternum as though she could physically contain the thing that was happening inside her chest. She had been called many things in Redstone Valley, Wyoming Territory, in the year of our Lord 1883. Stubborn, certainly. Foolish, by those who thought a woman running a homestead alone was a form of lunacy. Strong, occasionally, and usually said with an edge that suggested strength, was not entirely a compliment when it lived inside a woman's body. But brave. Said like that, said with that particular weight, as though it were the truest and most important thing a man had ever observed. She sat on that barrel outside Hargrove's General Store with the July sun blazing down and her heart knocking wildly against her ribs, and she tried very hard to remember how to breathe. She had not wanted to fall in love with Andrew Easton. She needed to be absolutely clear about that, even if only to herself, even sitting here on a flour barrel with sawdust on her boots. She had fought against it with every weapon a sensible woman in 1883 possessed, which were not very many, but she had deployed each one with considerable determination. None of it had worked. To understand how she had arrived at this particular moment on this particular boardwalk, a person would need to go back to the beginning of it. Back to the February morning, when Redstone Valley had still been buried in winter, and Andrew Easton had ridden into her life with snow on his coat and trouble written plain across his face. Maria Townsend had come to Wyoming Territory from Ohio 3 years prior, in the spring of 1880, following her husband, Daniel Townsend, who had been consumed by gold fever and the particular brand of reckless optimism that the West seemed to manufacture in certain men like a natural resource. Daniel had staked a claim north of what would become Redstone Valley, built a modest homestead on the edge of good grass and bad water, and then died of a fever in the October of 1881, leaving Maria with 43 acres of frozen ground, a mule named Corporal, $200 in savings that she had stitched into the lining of her winter coat, and absolutely no intention of going back to Ohio. Ohio meant her mother's tight-lipped concern and her brother's well-meaning suggestions about remarriage to men she had never met. Ohio meant giving up. Maria Townsend, who had crossed 3 states in a covered wagon while 5 months along with a child she ultimately lost on the trail, who had buried that child and her husband both and still gotten up the following morning and fed the mule, was not built for giving up. So she stayed. She worked the land through 1882 with a stubbornness that impressed even the most weathered ranchers in the valley. She put in a proper kitchen garden. She repaired the fencing herself, post by post, using a fence driver she had learned to operate by reading a manual 3 times over. She traded eggs and preserves at Hargrove's for the supplies she could not produce herself, and she kept meticulous accounts in a small leather-bound ledger that she regarded as something close to sacred, because numbers did not lie, and numbers told her, month by month, that she was making it. The other homesteaders and ranchers of Redstone Valley watched her with the particular mixture of admiration and bafflement that the frontier reserved for women who refused to collapse. They were kind enough, most of them. Sheriff Tom Graves kept an eye on her place during the worst of winter. The Peterson family, who ran cattle on the eastern edge of the valley, sent their youngest son over occasionally to help with heavy work, and Walt Hargrove extended her credit with a matter-of-fact generosity that he disguised as good business sense, because Walt was not the sort of man who enjoyed being thanked. It was into this fragile, hard-won peace that Andrew Easton had arrived in February of 1883, and it was fair to say that his arrival had not initially struck Maria as any kind of blessing. She had been in the barn that morning, working the stiffness out of Corporal's left foreleg, when she heard a horse on the road. She came to the barn door wiping her hands on her apron and saw a rider pulling up at her gate, a tall man on a dark bay horse, and her first instinct, honed by 2 years of living alone on the frontier, was a swift and practical wariness. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she judged, broad-shouldered under a canvas duster that was damp with snowmelt. His hat was battered and honest, the kind that had been rained on many times and had simply accepted that fact. He had a rifle in the saddle scabbard which was unremarkable in the territory, and a face that was angular and serious and, she would later admit, quite arrestingly good-looking in the way of a man who had no particular awareness of the fact. "Ma'am," he said, pulling up at the gate without coming through it, which she noted and approved of. "Andrew Easton. I bought the Kellerman place last autumn, about 2 miles east of you." She knew the Kellerman place. Old Werner Kellerman had gone back to his daughter in Kansas City. The previous fall, after his second winter alone, proved too much for his joints. She had not yet met whoever had bought the property. "Maria Townsend," she said, not moving from the barn door. "What brings you out in February, Mr. Easton?" He had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. "I need to ask a favor, Mrs. Townsend, and I recognize I have no right to ask it since we have never properly met. But I have got 3 ewes that are about to lamb in weather like this." He nodded at the pewter sky, which was making threats it clearly intended to keep, "and my knowledge of sheep is considerably less thorough than my knowledge of cattle. Walt Hargrove told me you kept a small flock before. I thought perhaps you might be willing to advise." Walt Hargrove, Maria thought, had a very wide definition of what constituted useful information to share with strangers, but the man had come to her gate and not through it. He had stated his need plainly without dressing it up as anything other than what it was, and the sky above them was the particular color of a sky that was about to drop 3 feet of snow on anyone caught unprepared. She had her own survival instincts, but she also had a code of conduct that the frontier had not yet managed to entirely erode, which was that you helped your neighbors because someday you would need help yourself. "Give me 10 minutes to get my coat," she said. She had spent 4 hours at the Kellerman place that day, and all 3 ewes had delivered safely, and Andrew Easton had made coffee on the iron stove in the farmhouse kitchen and handed her a cup without asking whether she wanted one, which she did, and they had sat at the kitchen table in the way of 2 practical people who had just done a practical thing together and found that it was not unpleasant. "Thank you," he said. "I was genuinely at a loss." "Wyoming sheep are hardier than they look," she told him, "but they need watching in weather like this. Where did you come from, Mr. Easton, before here?" There was a brief hesitation, just brief enough to register. "Texas most recently," he said. "Before that, several other places." She noticed the hesitation and filed it away, because Maria Townsend had learned early that what a person did not say was often more informative than what they did, and a man with a dark past did not always announce it, but it had a way of sitting in the room with you regardless. "And before Texas?" she asked, keeping her voice perfectly casual, the way you might ask about the weather. "Before Texas," he said, "I was doing work I am not especially proud of." "Nothing that would concern you," he added, and those dark eyes met hers directly, and there was something in them that was not evasion but was rather, she thought, a kind of clean honesty about the existence of a thing he was not ready to detail. "I came to Wyoming to do things differently. That is the whole truth of it." She had believed him. She was still not entirely certain why, except that the whole truth of it was exactly the kind of thing a man who was lying would never say, because a man who was lying would have constructed something more elaborate and more reassuring. "Well," she said, standing to put on her coat, "if the second you has trouble in the next few days, come and get me." "I will," he said, "and I would like to repay the favor somehow, Mrs. Townsend, when an opportunity presents itself." She had ridden home through the beginning of the snowstorm and told herself very firmly that she was not thinking about Andrew Easton's eyes. She told herself this several times over the following week, which suggested, in retrospect, that the effort was not being entirely successful. Spring came to Redstone Valley in fits and starts, as it always did. March brought mud and optimism in roughly equal proportions. April brought genuine warmth and the kind of renewal that made even the most practical people feel slightly philosophical. And with the thaw came the resumption of all the valley's normal rhythms and tensions, including several that Maria had been observing with considerable unease since the previous autumn. The trouble in the valley was not the explosive, gun-smoke kind of trouble that the dime novels back east liked to write about, though that variety was certainly not unknown in the territory. It was the slower, more insidious kind. It had a name, Cyrus Brand. Brand ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, the Circle B spread, which occupied the broad, flat ground along the river and had been expanding, year by year, with the sort of inexorable progress that had a habit of running right over smaller properties in its path. He was a big man in his late 40s with a mayor's politician's smile and a land agent's eyes, and he had been making offers on homesteads around the valley for 2 years now, and the offers had a way of becoming less polite when they were declined. Maria had declined one such offer the previous November. It had been made by Brand's foreman, a sharp-faced man named Colton Walsh, and it had been framed as a generous act of charity toward a widow woman who surely had sense enough to see that running a homestead alone was not sustainable. Maria had thanked Walsh for his time and shown him back to his horse with a pleasantness that she found required some effort to maintain. After that, small things had started going wrong on her property. Fence posts that she had set firmly appeared pulled from the ground. Her water diversion channel was blocked twice in ways that looked accidental but weren't. The final incident in late March had been a fire set in the dry grass at the edge of her western pasture, which she had smelled in time to grab the bucket brigade before it reached the barn. She could not prove Cyrus Brand's hand in any of it, and Tom Graves, who was a decent sheriff and an honest one, had told her plainly that without proof he could do nothing formal. "But you know what this is," she had said to Tom, not as an accusation but as a statement of the obvious. "I know what it looks like," Tom said carefully, "and I am going to be paying close attention. But Maria, please be careful. Brand has powerful friends in the territorial government. The kind of friends who can make a legal process bend in uncomfortable directions." She had thanked Tom and gone home and done what she always did, which was to keep working and keep her accounts and keep her eyes open. But the threat was real, and she knew it, and it sat in the back of her mind like a stone she could not dislodge. It was in the second week of April that Andrew Easton rode over with the repayment of the favor he had promised in February. He showed up on a Monday morning with a post driver, 2 coils of wire, and his own muscle, and without any preamble at all he said, "I heard about your fence posts. I have got time today if you want help resetting them properly." She looked at him. He looked back that same direct and unadorned gaze. "Who told you about the fence posts?" she asked. "Walt Hargrove. Walt seems to know a fair amount about the general state of things in this valley." "Walt Hargrove," Maria said, "is a one-man telegraph system." "Useful though," Andrew said. She could not argue with that, and the fence posts genuinely needed resetting. They spent the morning working side by side, and she discovered several things about Andrew Easton that the February visit had only hinted at. He worked with a focused competence that did not need commentary. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise for the sake of it, which was a quality she valued enormously in a person. When he had an opinion, he stated it clearly and without aggression, and when she disagreed with it, he listened to her disagreement with genuine attention rather than the performative patience that some men deployed when they were waiting for a woman to finish talking so they could repeat themselves. She disagreed with him once about the angle of a post, and he crouched down and considered it from her angle and then said, "You are right. I had that wrong," and corrected it and moved on without any further ceremony. She found this so unexpectedly refreshing that she had to bend over the wire coil for a moment to conceal the expression on her face. At noon, she fed him lunch, which was venison stew and bread and strong coffee, and it was over this meal that she learned more about the landscape of Andrew Easton. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had worked land his whole life and never owned it outright. His father had been the kind of man who had large dreams and small luck, and Andrew had watched that combination produce a particular species of bitterness over years, and he had decided very young that whatever he became, he would not become that. He had gone to Texas at 19 with the intention of making something of himself, and he had found work with a cattle outfit that was profitable and efficient, and he had eventually discovered, not entirely scrupulous about the source of the cattle it was selling. He told her this last part simply, looking at the table and then at her, because he had apparently decided that she warranted honesty. "I left when I understood what I was involved in," he said. "I was 23. I could tell myself I was young and ignorant, and there is some truth in that, but not enough to make me entirely comfortable. I spent 2 years doing ranch work for legitimate outfits in Texas and New Mexico, trying to feel like I had squared the account with myself. I'm not sure you ever entirely do, but I wanted land I had bought with clean money. That is what this is." "How old are you now?" she asked. 28, he said. She was 27. She did not offer this information immediately because she was still absorbing what he had told her and deciding what she thought of it. What she thought, she decided, was that a man who volunteered his own dark past without being asked, who framed it clearly and without self-pity and without excuse beyond what was true, and who was plainly building something better from the ground up on his own terms, was a man with a moral seriousness that was rarer than it should have been. "I appreciate you telling me that," she said. "I would rather you know it and form your own judgment than not know it and have it surface later in some worse way," he said. "I have neighbors now. I intend to be a good one." "You already are," she said. "You came out and reset my fence posts in April." Something shifted very briefly in his face. Something warm and careful, like a lamp being turned up just slightly before someone thought better of it and returned the dial to its original position. "I will keep an eye on your property," he said. "I know about brand. I do not need watching over, Mr. Easton." "No," he agreed immediately. "You do not. I am saying that an extra pair of eyes on the road between your land and mine is not the same thing as watching over you. It is just being a neighbor." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she poured them both more coffee and said, "All right, and call me Maria. Mrs. Townsend sounds like my mother-in-law." "Andrew," he said, and something in the way he said it, the way he offered his own name back in exchange for hers, felt like the beginning of something she did not yet have precise language for. May arrived with wildflowers on the hillsides and a renewed pressure from Cyrus Brand that was no longer quite as indirect. Brand himself came to see her in the first week of May, riding up in his good suit and his too-wide smile, and she met him at the gate in her work apron because she was not going to change her clothes for Cyrus Brand, and that was the end of it. He offered her a price for the homestead that was actually fair, or would have been in a world where accepting it did not mean admitting defeat to a man who had burned her grass and pulled her fence posts and tried to wear her down through a winter. She declined it, He pressed, pleasantly, inexorably, the way a river presses against a bank. She declined again. His smile did not change, but his eyes did, and she thought of Walt's warning about the territorial government and kept her own face absolutely neutral. "I admire your spirit, Mrs. Townsend," Brand said, gathering his reins. "But the territory is developing. Things change. I hope you will reconsider before the conditions become less favorable." "I will take that under advisement," she said, in a tone so perfectly gracious it would have been impossible to object to, and she watched him ride away and then went directly to her garden and pulled weeds with perhaps more force than the weeds strictly required. She told Andrew about it 2 days later when he came by to return a draw knife he had borrowed. She told it plainly, without drama, because that was how she handled things, and because Andrew was the kind of person she had discovered, with some surprise, that she wanted to tell things to. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, his expression was quiet and attentive, and contained a controlled anger that he did not let out into the room, but that she could see was absolutely there. "He is building a case for something," Andrew said. "Either he finds a legal angle to pressure you, or he escalates the property interference until you have a confrontation he can use. You need documentation of everything that has already happened." "I have been keeping records," she said, and went to get her ledger, and showed him the entries she had made, dates and descriptions of every incident, every suspicious occurrence, every fence post and fire and blocked water channel. He read through it with his finger tracking the lines, and then looked up at her with an expression she was not prepared for, which was a kind of wondering respect that hit her somewhere below her sternum and settled there. "This is good," he said. "This is exactly the kind of evidence Tom Graves can use if it ever comes to a formal complaint. You think ahead, Maria." "Someone has to," she said. "Not everyone does," he said. "Even people who need to." She took the ledger back and tried to appear as though being told she thought ahead by Andrew Easton had not done anything particular to her internal composure, which was becoming an increasingly elaborate performance. June brought the valley into its most beautiful season, the long, clear days when the light lasted until nearly 9 o'clock, and the grass was so green it looked like something a painter had invented, and the mountains to the west showed their full height above the foothills without any apology whatsoever. Maria loved June in Wyoming with a fervor that surprised even her sometimes, because she was not by nature a sentimental person, but the sheer physical magnificence of the place did something to her that she had never been able to entirely reduce to practical terms. She and Andrew had fallen into a rhythm that was not quite anything she had a name for, which was in itself an unusual situation for a woman who preferred to name things. He came by 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with a purpose and sometimes without one, and she found herself watching the road between her place and his with a frequency that she would have found embarrassing if she had paused to examine it too closely. They talked about everything. About the valley and its politics and the slow burn of Brand's expansion. About farming and the particular challenges of Wyoming soil and the water rights that were the real underlying currency of power in any agricultural territory. About books, because Andrew read, which she had discovered with a pleasure that she sternly refused to let herself describe as delight, since she had a copy of Darwin that she had been working through, and he had an opinion about it, and they had argued the point for a happy 45 minutes one evening while sitting on her porch in the long June light. They talked about less practical things too, the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people have decided, even without saying so, that they are going to be honest with each other. She told him about Daniel, about the marriage that had been affectionate and companionable and not passionate, about the child she had lost on the trail, about the grief that was not so much a wound any more as a scar, permanent and sometimes aching but no longer open. He listened to all of it with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of someone waiting for it to be over, but the steadiness of someone who understood that some things needed to be said out loud before they stopped having their full weight, and that the best service you could offer was simply to be present for the saying of it. He told her about Texas again, more of it this time. The boss who had known exactly what the operation was and had hired young men specifically because they were young enough not to ask the right questions. The cold realization, arriving gradually and then all at once, of what he had been participating in. The physical fact of leaving, which had not been simple, because men who ran that kind of operation did not generally appreciate departures. There had been a confrontation, he told her. A man with a gun, and a conviction that Andrew owed a debt he could not be allowed to simply walk away from. He told her the outcome of that confrontation with the same quiet directness with which he told everything else, and she heard in it the confirmation of what she had already suspected, which was that Andrew Easton had a capacity for decisive action in extreme circumstances that he did not enjoy and did not advertise, but that was absolutely real. "Is the matter concluded?" she asked, because that was the question that mattered. "It is," he said. "The man I worked for was arrested 18 months ago on charges that had nothing to do with me. The man who confronted me is no longer a concern. I have not looked over my shoulder for more than a year." She nodded, and let that be sufficient. "Good," she said. "You are remarkably unshocked," he said, with a faint note of something that might have been wonder. "Mr. Easton," she said, "I crossed Kansas in a covered wagon with a dead child and a dying husband, and I have lived alone on the frontier for 2 years while a powerful man tried to drive me off my land. I have a fairly broad definition of what constitutes a reason to be shocked." He looked at her for a moment across the small kitchen table, and the lamp between them lit the angles of his face and the particular quality of his eyes, and she was very aware of the silence in the room and the distance between them, and the fact that she had not looked away and neither had he. "Maria," he said, and stopped. "Andrew," she said, equally carefully. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment, and then she reached across and topped up his coffee cup, and he thanked her, and they went back to talking about water rights, and both of them were aware that something had been acknowledged even though neither of them had used any particular words to acknowledge it. July came with its full heat, and with it came the escalation from Brand that Andrew had predicted. The first indication was a legal notice, delivered to Maria by a county official from Cheyenne, informing her that Cyrus Brand was filing a claim that her homestead's water diversion constituted an illegal alteration of a natural watercourse in violation of territorial water law. The claim was, on its face, thin, but it was backed by the signature of a territorial judge named Carver, whose relationship with Brand's financial interests was, as Tom Graves put it with careful understatement, not entirely distant. Maria read the notice twice, folded it precisely, and rode to Andrew's place. He was in the middle of repairing his barn roof when she arrived, and he climbed down when he saw her face and took the notice from her and read it without comment, and when he looked up there was that controlled anger again, contained and exact. "Judge Carver," he said, "you know him. Of him. He has a reputation in the territorial courts that does not entirely reflect his official record. He rules in favor of men who can make it worth his while." He handed the notice back. "We need to get you a proper attorney. There is a man in Laramie, James Whitfield, who has handled cases like this before and won them." "That costs money," she said. "It does," he agreed. "I can help with that." She looked at him. "I will not take your money, Andrew. Then consider it a loan at no interest, repayable when you choose, to a neighbor who has a direct interest in the precedent this case sets. If Brand can take your water rights on a fabricated claim, mine are next. I am not being charitable. I am being practical." She recognized this rhetorical strategy, which was to frame a generous act as a self-interested one, so that she could accept it without feeling beholden, and she was simultaneously touched by it and slightly exasperated by how well he knew her. "That is very conveniently practical," she said. "I thought so," he said, and there was the faintest edge of a smile on his mouth, and it was so rare, that smile, that when it appeared it had the effect of entirely rearranging the landscape of his face into something that she found profoundly inconvenient. She hired James Whitfield. He was a precise man in his 40s with an impressive command of territorial water law and a clear-eyed disdain for Judge Carver that he expressed in terms so measured and careful that they were devastating. He began building the countercase with Maria's ledger, with testimony from Walt Hargrove and Tom Graves, and with a survey of the water diversion that demonstrated conclusively that it predated the relevant territorial statute. In the meantime, the valley continued. Maria tended her crops and her small flock, and Corporal the mule, who was aging and opinionated and whom she loved unreasonably. She traded at Hargrove's. She attended the monthly community meeting at the Redstone Schoolhouse, where Valley residents discussed the business of surviving together in a difficult territory. And she continued to see Andrew, now most days, the rhythm of it having become so natural that she had mostly stopped noticing it except when it was absent. And the absence, on the days when he did not come or she did not ride over to his place, left a particular quiet that she was not going to examine too carefully. It was at one of the community meetings in the second week of July that something happened which clarified several things at once. Brand was there, as he sometimes was, radiating the comfortable authority of a man who thought the room's business was ultimately his business. He made some remarks about water use in the valley that were entirely civil and entirely pointed, and Maria, who was seated 3 rows back, felt the specific weight of each remark as it was clearly intended to be felt. What she did not expect was for Andrew, who was standing at the back of the room in his usual position of someone attending but not inserting himself unless necessary, to speak. "I would like to make an observation," he said, and his voice had the same quiet certainty it always had, but with an undertone of iron that she felt in the back of her neck. "The water law in this territory protects established uses. Any attempt to reinterpret that law in ways that benefit one operation at the expense of smaller landholders is not development. It is consolidation by legal fiction, and I think most people in this room understand the difference." There was a silence. Brand looked at Andrew with the measuring look of a man recalibrating a threat. "Mr. Easton," Brand said pleasantly, "you are new here. The valley has complexities you may not yet appreciate." "I appreciate the complexity of a fabricated water claim supported by a paid judge," Andrew said, still pleasantly, "and I suspect most of the people in this room appreciate it too." There was a murmur in the room. Not a loud one, but the kind of murmur that contains a consensus. Maria, sitting in the 3rd row, was very still. She had not asked him to say that. She had not expected it. And the fact that he had said it without consultation, without positioning it as help or protection, but simply as a man who had looked at an injustice and named it out loud in a room full of people who needed to hear someone name it, produced a feeling in her chest that she was genuinely not prepared for. She looked at her hands in her lap and told herself to be reasonable. After the meeting, walking to the horses in the summer dark, Brand intercepted Andrew in a way that was technically social and actually something else. She watched from a slight distance as the 2 men exchanged some words she could not hear, and she saw Andrew's posture, which was relaxed and open and not remotely concerned, and she saw Brand's, which had the tightly contained irritation of a man unaccustomed to having obstacles that did not eventually move. Andrew joined her at Corporal's hitching post and handed her the mule's reins. "What did he say?" she asked. "He suggested that I consider whether my investment in the valley was wisely placed," Andrew said. "I told him I thought it was very wisely placed indeed." Something in the way he said it, looking at her as he said it, made it clear that he was not only talking about land. She took Corporal's reins and looked at the stars, which were extravagant over Wyoming in July, and she thought about the fence posts and the fire and the legal notice, and the 2 years of solitude and the mule and the ledger and the man standing beside her who had ridden to her gate in February and not come through it without being invited. "You know," she said carefully, "you do not have to make yourself a target for brand on my account." "I am not doing it on your account," he said. "I am doing it because it is right. Those two things happen to coincide, which is convenient." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars too, his profile clear and angular in the moonlight, and there was something in the set of his jaw that was entirely determined and entirely honest and entirely him. And she thought, clearly and distinctly, and without any ambivalence whatsoever, that she was in serious trouble. She rode home alone and told herself that she would think about it tomorrow, which was the frontier woman's version of an emotional postponement strategy, and it worked approximately as well as such strategies generally do. The legal case moved through July with the careful pace of territorial justice. Whitfield was methodical and brilliant, and the counter-evidence was strong, but Judge Carver's influence was real, and there was a period of 3 weeks in the middle of the month when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and Maria went about her days with the particular controlled composure of someone sitting on a great deal of anxiety and refusing to let it spill. Andrew was a steady presence through all of it. Not hovering, not intrusive, not treating her as someone who needed managing, but simply there, reliably and consistently, in the way that an absolutely dependable thing is there. And she found that this reliability, which she had always valued as a practical quality in tools and weather patterns and mules, had an entirely different effect when it lived inside a person. She was hanging washing on the line in the last week of July when she heard horses on the road, 2 riders moving fast, and she had the specific tightening in her chest that 2 years of Brand's interference had trained into her, the immediate readiness for trouble. But it was Andrew, and with him was Tom Graves, and the expression on Tom's face was the expression of a man bearing good news who is having some difficulty containing it. "Whitfield won," Tom said, pulling up his horse. "Carver got overruled by the district court. Your water rights are confirmed." Apparently the territorial governor was less fond of Brand's methods than Brand had assumed, and Whitfield knew exactly which desk to put the evidence on. Maria stood in the yard with a half-hung bedsheet in her hands and looked at Tom and then at Andrew, and she felt the 3 weeks of managed anxiety drain out of her in one long, clean release. "Well," she said, and her voice was only very slightly unsteady. "Well." Andrew looked at her with those careful eyes, and she thought she could see every single thing he was not yet saying, packed behind that steady gaze like a letter that had been written but not yet sent. "Congratulations," he said. "You held your ground." "We held it," she said, "because that was the truth." Tom made a polite excuse about needing to get back to town, which was the most transparent pretense he had probably employed in his entire career as a lawman, and left them standing in the yard with the bedsheet between them and the summer light everywhere. "I have been meaning to say something to you," Andrew said. "And I have been waiting until this particular thing was resolved because it did not seem right to say it while you had this hanging over you." Her heart was doing something that she was not going to describe as anything other than normal cardiovascular activity. "Andrew," she said, "I am not good at this," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I am considerably better at resetting fence posts than at saying the kind of thing I am about to try to say." "You are doing all right so far," she said. He looked at her. There was that rare, brief shift in his face, that warming. "Maria," he said, "I would very much like, if it is not unwelcome to you, to be allowed to say plainly that I have feelings for you that have been developing since approximately February, and that I have been trying to handle with some degree of restraint because I did not want to complicate your life when you had enough to deal with." She held the bedsheet. "Your restraint," she said, "has been noticed and appreciated, but it has also been, I will tell you privately, somewhat maddening." He blinked. Something lit up in his expression that she had never quite seen there before. "Maddening," he repeated. "Somewhat," she said. "Yes. In a good way or a bad way?" He asked, and there was something almost unguarded in the question, something younger and less certain than his usual manner, and she found it entirely devastating. "In a very good way," she said, and put the bedsheet down. They stood in the yard in the late July afternoon, and she thought she had never in her life been so aware of the distance between herself and another person. And then Andrew Easton took 2 steps and covered it, and he lifted his hand and touched her face with a care that made the simple gesture feel like a declaration. And she thought, with perfect clarity, that she had been right in February and every day since. "I do not know everything about what comes next," he said quietly. "Neither do I," she said. "I think that is actually the point." He kissed her in the bright afternoon, in the yard of her homestead, with the bedsheet on the ground beside them and Corporal watching with the supreme indifference of a mule who had seen considerably more dramatic things. And she thought it was quite possibly the most honest and uncomplicated thing that had happened to her in 3 years, and that it felt, against all her prepared defenses, completely right. The days following that afternoon had a different quality to them, warm and specific and full of small moments that Maria found herself storing with an attention she had previously reserved for more practical matters. The way Andrew arrived at her gate in the mornings and waited still until she came out, because that particular habit of his had not changed. The way they worked alongside each other with the ease of 2 people who had already learned each other's rhythms. The conversations that ranged across everything and arrived at their true subjects by way of all the surrounding ones. He courted her with a seriousness and a patience that was entirely his own, and she received his attention with the particular mixture of warmth and clear-eyed assessment that was entirely hers. And it was not a simple thing or a fast thing, because they were not simple people, and they were not living simple lives, but it was a real thing, and she thought that was worth considerably more. She told Ruth Peterson about it in August, because Ruth was her closest friend in the valley and had been dropping what she clearly considered subtle hints about Andrew Easton for 3 months. Ruth's response was a satisfaction so immediate and complete that Maria laughed for the first time in what felt like a very long time, a proper laugh, unguarded and genuine, and Ruth looked at her and said, "There you are." And Maria was not entirely sure what she meant but understood it completely. Brand made one more attempt in August, not legal this time but social, a calculated effort to use community influence to isolate the smaller homesteaders who had testified in the water rights case. It was the kind of quiet intimidation that relied on people's fear of being on the wrong side of the most powerful man in the valley. And it might have worked if the water rights victory had not produced its own kind of momentum. Walt Hargrove, who had a gift for plain speaking, addressed it at the August community meeting in terms that left very little room for ambiguity, and Tom Graves backed him up with the authority of his office, and Andrew stood at the back of the room and said nothing at all, which was, Maria had come to understand, Andrew's way of being present and unmovable without needing to perform either quality. Brand understood a lost position when he saw one. He did not leave the valley, and he did not become harmless, but the campaign against Maria's property ended, and the valley settled back into its normal complicated rhythms, and she thought that sometimes the most dramatic victories looked, on their surface, like very little happening. And it was in this aftermath, in the quiet week that followed, that she had gone to Hargrove's general store to pick up sugar and flour, and found herself on the boardwalk outside with her hand on the door, listening to the conversation she had never expected to hear. She sat on the barrel with her hand on her chest, and inside the store Walt was saying something she could not quite catch, and Andrew's voice came again, quieter now, as if he were aware that the window was open. She should know it, Andrew was saying, and there was something rough-edged in his voice now, the careful control loosened slightly. The things that woman has survived and kept going through and still managed to maintain her integrity and her land and her sense of who she is. I do not know another person like her. I have not met one. Walt said something that sounded like agreement. I just wanted to say it to someone, Andrew said. in case it needed saying. Maria sat on the barrel with the July sun on her and her hands in her lap, and thought about a man in a canvas duster at her gate in February, not coming through until he was invited. She thought about fence posts and lambing ewes and a ledger, and a letter full of honest words. She thought about the way he had looked at her that afternoon in the yard before he kissed her, with that complete and careful attention, as if she were the most real thing he had ever seen. She thought that she had come to Wyoming 3 years ago following someone else's dream, and had stayed to build her own, and that she had not planned any particular part of it beyond the most immediate practical next step, and that this was probably the correct way to live in a place and a time that did not allow for very distant planning. And somewhere in all of that, without planning it at all, she had walked into the best thing that had happened to her, and he was 20 feet away talking about her to a shopkeeper, and she could not decide whether to laugh or cry, and settled on sitting very still and looking at the mountains. She heard the store door open and felt the vibration of boots on the boardwalk, and then Andrew came around the corner of the building and stopped when he saw her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. She could see the moment he understood that she had been sitting there for some time, and the precise quality of what had produced that particular expression on her face, which was not an expression he had seen her wear before, and which she suspected was fairly transparent. "How long were you there?" He said. "Long enough," she said. The silence was very complete and very warm, and the mountains were still beautiful in the background. Andrew crouched down so that he was at her eye level, which was such a specific and characteristic thing for him to do, to make himself equal to her rather than standing over her, that she felt it as its own kind of declaration. "I meant every word of it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is rather the point." He reached out and took her hand where it lay in her lap, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it undid 3 years of careful practical self-containment in approximately 4 seconds. And she thought, with the last clear corner of her mind, that brave was perhaps the wrong word for what she was. What she was, she thought, was simply unwilling to let fear make her choices, which was not the same thing as not feeling it. "I have something to ask you," Andrew said, "and I have been waiting for the right moment, and I am aware that this is not perhaps the most romantic setting, sitting on a barrel outside Hargrove's with flower dust in the air, but it seems like the right moment anyway." "Is this the kind of question I think it is?" she said. "It might be," he said. "Maria, I would like to spend the rest of my life being your neighbor in the most permanent and thorough sense available. I would like to marry you if you will have me. I would like to build something with you, not just the land, though certainly also the land, but something bigger than that." She looked at him for a long moment. The mountains were behind him and the sky was enormous, and old Corporal the mule was tied to the post 10 feet away looking philosophical, and somewhere inside the store Walt Hargrove was probably listening through the window with enormous satisfaction. "Yes," she said, "I will have you. And Andrew, I need you to know, equally clearly, that I am not marrying you because I need someone to help me hold the land or fight brand or reset fence posts. I am marrying you because you are the best person I have met in the territory, and I am in love with you, and those are the only reasons that count." Something happened to his face that she had seen only in pieces before, but that now arrived complete, a warmth and an openness that he had been holding back, she thought, for quite some time, and it transformed him from the careful, guarded, fundamentally private man he was in the world into the person he was when he let himself be, and she thought that she was very lucky to be the person who got to see that. He stood up and brought her with him, her hand still in his, and he kissed her again on the boardwalk of Hargrove's General Store with the whole July Valley watching, and she thought she did not mind the watching at all. They were married in September of 1883 by the minister of the Redstone Community Church, in the small white building that also served as a schoolroom in front of most of the valley's population, because Walt Hargrove had let the information circulate, and the valley had decided collectively that this was something worth attending. Ruth Peterson stood up with Maria, and Tom Graves stood up with Andrew, and the Peterson children threw wildflower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and Walt himself, standing in the back in his good coat, looked as satisfied as a man who had been providing useful information for months and was now watching it bear its most complete fruit. Maria wore her best dress, dark blue wool that she had let out at the waist and re-hemmed 2 years ago and had kept carefully since, and she carried a small bunch of late summer flowers that Ruth had assembled from the valley meadow, and she walked to the front of that small church with her chin level and her heart wide open and her eyes on Andrew, who was standing there in a dark coat that he had clearly purchased for the occasion, and was looking at her with an expression of such complete and transparent happiness that she thought she would carry it for the rest of her life. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them plainly, both of them, looking at each other rather than at the minister, and when the minister said Andrew could kiss his bride, Andrew did, and the assembled valley residents expressed their approval with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested some of them had been waiting for this for months. Ruth hugged her afterward, fiercely and without ceremony. "I am so happy for you," Ruth said into her hair. "Both of you." Tom Graves shook Andrew's hand with the satisfied expression of a man who had been keeping an eye on a situation and was glad it had resolved well. Walt Hargrove handed Maria a small package at the reception, which was held at the Peterson farm because they had the most space, and which contained a set of 5 account ledgers, bound in good leather with her name on each one, except that the name was Maria Easton. She looked at it and then at Walt, who looked entirely innocent and completely guilty of premeditation. "You planned this," she told him. "I keep useful information," Walt said. "I believe we have established that." She laughed and put the ledger carefully in her basket, and went back to find her husband, which was a word she was going to need some time to adjust to, and which she found she could not think without a warmth that was becoming a constant presence in her chest. The 2 properties, Maria's homestead and Andrew's Kellerman place, were adjacent enough that consolidating them made both practical and legal sense, and they spent the late autumn working out the logistics of combining 2 separate operations into one, which was considerably more complicated than it sounded, because both of them had strong and specific views about how things ought to be done, and neither was inclined to simply defer to the other. And the negotiations were therefore extended and occasionally heated and resulted, on balance, in a better arrangement than either would have arrived at alone. They merged the flocks and the cattle. They converted Maria's barn to the main stable and Andrew's to storage. They kept Maria's water diversion, which was now legally inviolable, and added a secondary channel from the creek that served Andrew's original fields. They combined their accounts into a single ledger, which they kept together on the shelf above the kitchen stove, and the numbers in it were, for the first time in 2 years of Maria's careful management, genuinely comfortable. The house they chose was Maria's, not because Andrew's was inferior, but because Maria had built hers, post by post and board by board, in ways that had made her feel it was hers in a way that a purchased property never quite could be. And Andrew understood this immediately when she explained it and said only, "Then we will make it ours together," and proceeded to do exactly that. He added a second room before winter, which he built with the same focused competence he brought to everything, and she helped with the parts she could, and watched the parts she couldn't, and thought that there was something deeply satisfying about watching a person who was good at things be good at things. Their first winter together was also Wyoming's worst in 5 years, and it came early and hard, with snow in October that did not melt until April and temperatures that tested every animal and structure on the property. They lost 2 ewes and 1 calf to the worst of it, which was a loss but a manageable one. They kept everything else alive by the combination of Maria's methodical preparation and Andrew's willingness to work through conditions that were honestly brutal, and they did it together, which made every part of it easier. In the long evenings of that winter, with the fire high and the snow thick against the windows. They read to each other and argued about books and talked about everything from the philosophy of Western expansion to the mechanics of fence construction. And Maria thought that this was what she had not known she was missing. Not just help or partnership in the practical sense, but the specific and irreplaceable experience of being thoroughly known by another person and knowing them in return. She told him things she had not told anyone. About Ohio and her mother and the particular small cruelties of a woman being told, with great gentleness, that she was not enough on her own. About Daniel and the genuine grief of losing him, not the passionate grief of someone whose heart had been broken, but the sadder and perhaps harder grief of someone who had lost a companion and a partner in a project they had started together. About the child on the trail, who had been a boy, who had been alive for 2 days and who she had named James and whose grave was in Kansas, and whom she still thought of on October mornings. Andrew listened to all of it. He did not minimize or redirect. He sat across the fire from her and was absolutely present for everything she said. And when she finished, he came and sat beside her and put his arm around her and did not say anything at all, because he understood that some things did not require a response, only a witness. She loved him for that, specifically and precisely, the way she loved a number of specific and precise things about him, including the way he talked to horses and the way he expressed disagreement, which was always direct and never cruel, and the way he looked at the mountains sometimes when he did not know she was watching, as if he were having a private conversation with something very large and very old. In the spring of 1884, 2 things happened in close succession. The first was that Cyrus Brand made his last play for control of the valley. He had evidently decided that if legal and social methods had failed, a straightforward economic one might succeed, and he quietly bought the debt of 3 smaller homesteaders who had been struggling through the hard winter, then called the notes in March, which would have forced those families off their land entirely. It was exactly the kind of move that was technically legal and morally outrageous, and the valley's response to it was the kind of collective action that frontier communities generated when sufficiently provoked. Andrew organized the counter-effort with a precision that Maria watched with admiration, pulling together a consortium of the valley's more financially stable operations, including her own, to purchase the debts from Brand at face value before the foreclosures could proceed. Brand had not expected that level of coordination, and his expression at the legal transaction, which Maria attended because she had contributed to it and had the right to be present, was the expression of a man who had made a serious miscalculation about the solidarity of the people he had been trying to separate. He did not contest it. He had no legal ground to do so. And 3 weeks later, with a calculation that was entirely in character, he sold the Circle B to a ranching company from Denver and moved his operations to another territory. And Redstone Valley had a celebration that lasted 2 days and involved the consumption of a remarkable quantity of Walt Hargrove's best whiskey. Maria allowed herself 1 glass and said a quiet and entirely private thank you to the mountains for the kind of resolve that had seen her through the last 18 months, and then she went home and told Andrew, who had been working at the far field all day, and his smile when she told him was the full, unguarded one, and it was still the same effect it had always had on her, not diminished by familiarity but, if anything, deepened by it. The second thing that happened in the spring of 1884 was that Maria realized she was expecting a child. She told Andrew on a Tuesday morning in April, quietly, in the kitchen over coffee, with the directness that characterized all the most important things she said to him. She watched his face move through a sequence of expressions, and the one that settled was a joy so fundamental it was almost solemn, and he set down his coffee cup and came around the table and held her with a gentleness that made her close her eyes for a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was quiet. "I am frightened," she said honestly, "because of James, because of what happened before." "I know," he said. "I am going to be here for everything." She had the right doctor this time, a trained physician from Laramie named Dr. Eleanor Burke, who was one of a small number of women practicing medicine in the territory and who was, Maria discovered, the kind of doctor she had always wished for, competent and clear-spoken, and absolutely unwilling to minimize or dismiss a patient's concern. Dr. Burke visited regularly through the summer, and the pregnancy progressed steadily, and Maria, who was not by nature given to anxiety, managed her fear with the same method she had always managed difficult things, which was to gather accurate information, make appropriate preparations, and keep working. She kept working through July and most of August, somewhat against Dr. Burke's advice, though she made concessions to the reality of her situation and let Andrew and the Peterson boy handle the heavier lifting. She tended her garden and kept her accounts and rode to Hargrove's when she needed to. And the valley, which was aware of her condition because the valley was aware of everything, treated her with an affectionate protectiveness that she found alternately touching and very slightly maddening. Her son was born in September of 1884, a year to the month after the wedding, in the bed of their farmhouse with Dr. Burke attending and Ruth Peterson holding her hand and Andrew in the next room doing an admirable job of maintaining composure when he was almost certainly not. He was a healthy boy, large and loud and immediately insistent about his opinions, and when they brought him to Maria, he looked up at her with the unfocused intensity of new life, and she thought about James and felt the grief of him, still there, still real, and then felt the separate and enormous reality of this child who was here and alive and squirming with indignant vitality in her arms. "Hello," she said to him. Andrew came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man who had just encountered something that entirely exceeded the categories he had prepared, and Maria watched him and thought that she had been right about every important thing. They named the boy Daniel Andrew Easton, Daniel for the dead and Andrew for the living, which Maria thought was the right way to carry both of them. Daniel was, from his first weeks, a person with strongly held positions on every subject, particularly feeding schedules and the injustice of being put down when he wished to be held, and he had his father's angular face and his mother's dark eyes, and he was the most demanding and most adored thing on the property, which was saying something given how the mule felt about his own status. Corporal, to his credit, accepted the new addition to the household with philosophical equanimity, which was perhaps the greatest evidence of his good character. The seasons moved through 1885 and into 1886 with the rhythm that Maria had come to know and love as the particular rhythm of this place, hard and beautiful, and requiring constant attention and yielding. In return, something that she thought could only be called abundance, not in the gold rush sense, not in the sense of excess or windfall, but in the deeper sense of a life that was full of exactly what it was meant to be full of. Daniel grew with the terrifying speed of healthy children, and was walking by autumn of 1885 and talking, in his emphatic and largely grammatical way, by the spring of 1886, and had a specific and unshakable attachment to Corporal the mule that Maria thought was both charming and slightly worrying given Corporal's temperament around strangers. But Corporal, it turned out, made an exception for Daniel that he made for almost no one else. And the two of them could be found on any given afternoon conducting what appeared to be a serious conversation about the nature of things. Andrew watched this with a tenderness that was so unguarded in those private moments of watching his son that Maria thought she could live 100 years in this valley and not exhaust the small and large revelations of loving this man. The valley itself was changing, slowly, the way the territory was changing, the railroad extending its reach, new settlers coming in, the rough edges of frontier life beginning to smooth in places. The Redstone School, which had been meeting in the community church, got its own proper building in 1885, and Maria was on the committee that organized the construction, because she thought the single most important thing you could do for a community's future was to give its children somewhere to learn. She hired a young teacher from Pennsylvania, a steady and dedicated woman named Clara Webb, who was teaching 6 grades in one room and doing it with an energy that reminded Maria, sometimes, of herself. The injustices of the territory did not resolve themselves easily or quickly, and Maria was aware of them in ways that living on the frontier made difficult to ignore. The Shoshone communities whose land the settlers had taken were living under conditions that were documented and shameful, and the legal protections that were supposed to apply to them were applied unevenly and often not at all. Maria wrote letters about this to the territorial government and to the newspapers in Cheyenne, because writing letters was one thing she could do, and Andrew read every letter before she sent it and never once suggested she soften them, which she considered an important thing to know about a person. In the spring of 1886, when Daniel was 18 months old and the property was running better than it ever had, Maria discovered that she was expecting again. This time the fear was present but smaller, not because the risk was less real but because she had evidence now that things could go well, and she had Dr. Burke again, and she had Andrew, and she had the steady accumulated confidence of a woman who had survived a great deal and had reason to believe she could survive more. Their daughter was born in November of 1886, during a snowstorm, which seemed entirely characteristic of the timing. She came into the world as loudly and emphatically as her brother had, and she had Maria's determined jaw and Andrew's steady eyes and a head of dark hair that made her look, Walt Hargrove declared when he came to see her, like a miniature portrait of her mother. They named her Eleanor, for Dr. Burke, who had been a steady presence through both births, and who received this honor with the precise and slightly flustered gratitude of a woman who was more accustomed to being practical than being celebrated. Daniel, confronted with his sister, conducted an assessment of approximately 3 minutes and then declared her acceptable, which Maria and Andrew received as the complete approval it clearly was. By the winter of 1886, the Easton homestead was a working property of 63 acres with a small cattle operation, a healthy sheep flock, a kitchen garden that had expanded to include a root cellar and a cold house, and a reputation in the valley as a place of reliable competence and reasonable hospitality. Walt Hargrove's credit ledger showed the Easton account in the black, which Walt communicated to Maria with the satisfied air of a man watching a long-running project reach its proper conclusion. Maria, who had long since stopped being surprised by her own resilience, was sometimes stopped short by the simple reality of her life. She would be in the garden, or at the stove, or sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger, and she would become abruptly aware of the morning light on the mountains through the window, and Daniel's voice somewhere outside, and Eleanor's small warm weight when she carried her, and Andrew's presence in the next room or the next field or the road between their land and town, and she would think, simply and clearly, that she had built this. All of it. From the ground up, starting with nothing and a mule and $200 sewn into a coat. Andrew found her like this once in the early spring of 1887, standing at the kitchen window with a coffee cup cooling in her hands and a look on her face he could not immediately read. He came up behind her and looked out the window with her, at the yard and the barn and the first tentative green on the hillside, and put his hands on her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I am happy," she said. "That I have been happy for quite some time now, and I keep being surprised by it." "Does it surprise you?" he said. "It used to be harder to come by," she said. "I think I still have the reflex of expecting it to be difficult." "It still is difficult," he said. "We still have hard winters and dry summers and ornery neighbors and a mule with opinions. It is just all so good." "Both things at once," she said. "Both things at once," he agreed, and rested his chin on top of her head, which was a gesture he had developed somewhere in their first winter that she had never objected to and now would have missed like an absent limb. Redstone Valley in the spring of 1887 was in the middle of the slow transformation from a frontier outpost to something that had more in common with the settled communities further east, not entirely comfortable with its own progress, still rough-edged enough to require the kind of daily competence and practical courage that the earlier years had demanded, but with a texture of permanence that was new. The school had 16 students. The church had a proper congregation. The general store had expanded, Walt having invested in a second room that he filled with goods he had previously had to send people to Laramie for. Tom Graves was on his third term as sheriff and likely to serve a fourth. The Easton property was, by the spring of 1887, one of the established homesteads of the valley, which meant that newer arrivals sometimes came to Andrew and Maria for advice, and they gave it freely, because both of them remembered what it was to arrive in a new place without knowledge of the particular geography of survival it demanded. There was a young couple who had come in October of 1886 from Georgia, James and Frances Whitlow, who had taken up a claim on the north edge of the valley, and who were navigating their first Wyoming winter with the kind of terrified determination Maria recognized absolutely. She brought Frances preserved food twice through January, and Andrew helped James set a proper chimney flue that would not be a fire risk. And by spring, the Whitlows had made it through and had the look of people who had discovered something about themselves they had not previously known. Maria watched Frances Whitlow's face over the spring, the way the fear of that first winter was being replaced by something steadier and more confident, and thought of her own face in the mirror in the spring of 1882, after her first winter alone on the homestead, and felt a recognition that was entirely wordless and entirely complete. The summer of 1887 was long and good, the kind of summer the valley produced every few years that made everyone who lived there feel they had made exactly the right choice in staying. Daniel, who was 2 3/4 and had opinions about this, spent the summer in a state of perpetual motion and intense investigation of everything within reach. And Alina, who was 8 months old by July, and had apparently decided that sitting still was for people with less important business to conduct, attempted to follow her brother everywhere with the determined crawling of someone who had identified a goal, and was not going to let the details of physical capability slow her down. Andrew watched his daughter attempt to pull herself up on the fence post one warm July afternoon and said, "She is going to give me gray hair. She is going to run this valley," Maria said. "Both," Andrew said, probably simultaneously. On a particular afternoon that July, Andrew rode into town for supplies, and Maria spent the morning in the garden and then walked down to Hargrove's herself, because she needed sugar and thread and had promised Ruth Peterson some of her dried sage. She had a leaner in the sling against her chest and Daniel by the hand, and it was a perfect afternoon, the kind that made the mountains look painted and the air smell like everything good that had ever grown. She reached the boardwalk of Hargrove's and was about to go in when she heard voices through the open window, and one of them was Andrew's, and she stopped. She stopped because she heard her name, and then she heard what came after it, and her hand fell from the door, and her knees, which had seen 2 years of frontier hardship and a brutal Wyoming winter and a water rights battle and 2 births, had the same opinion they had formed the first time she stood on this boardwalk and heard these words. The bravest woman in the valley. Walt said something she could not quite catch, and Andrew said, "No, I am serious. After everything she has been through and everything she has built. The way she handled Brand, the way she handled the legal case, the way she raised that boy and is raising that girl, the things she does for this community, the letters she writes, the people she helps. She does not do it to be seen doing it. She does it because she thinks it is right. I have never met anyone braver." And then Walt said distinctly, because Walt's voice carried when he wanted it to, "You should tell her that, Andrew." A pause. "She knows," Andrew said, and there was something in his voice that was the deep, settled certainty of a man talking about something he is sure of at a level below words. "Tell her anyway," Walt said. Maria stood on the boardwalk with Alina sleeping against her chest and Daniel's hand in hers and the July sun warm on her back, and she sat down on the same barrel she had sat on 4 years ago because her knees had the same opinion they had always had about being told she was brave by Andrew Easton. Daniel looked up at her with his father's serious face. "Mama's sitting," he observed, as a matter of factual record. "Yes," she agreed. "Mama is sitting." She sat there for a long moment, looking at the mountains she had been looking at for 7 years, and thought about the woman who had come to this territory following someone else's dream, and had stayed to build something entirely her own, and had fought for it and grieved for it and loved it, and had built, alongside all of it, something she had not planned and had not been looking for, and which had turned out to be the most essential thing. The store door opened and Andrew came out, and he stopped when he saw her, and his expression did exactly what it had always done, moved through brief calculation to something warm and real and entirely for her. "Were you out here long?" he said. "Long enough," she said, which was what she had said the first time too. Something moved in his face. "Maria, you should tell me to my face," she said, "when you are going to say things like that." He came and crouched in front of her, the same as he had done 4 years ago. Eye level, equal, and Alina slept against her chest, and Daniel stood beside her watching his father with uncomplicated trust, and Andrew looked at her with all the steadiness and all the honesty and all the care that she had loved in him from the very beginning, even before she had the word for it. "You are," he said, "the bravest person I know, the strongest person I know. The person who makes this valley and this property and this family what it is, and I know I do not say it enough." "You say it where you think I cannot hear you," she said. "I will say it where you can," he said. She reached out and took his face in both her hands, Alina warm between them, Daniel solemnly observing, and she said, "I love you, Andrew Easton. From the fence posts in February to right now on this boardwalk, every day of it." "Every day of it," he said. "All the way forward." Walt Hargrove appeared at the store window, regarded this scene with the expression of a man whose information-sharing policy had once again produced its intended result, and retired to the back of the store with his dignity intact. The years that followed laid themselves down like seasons, each one bringing its own texture and weight and beauty. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who had his father's precision and his mother's restless intelligence, and who by age 8 was keeping his own small account book of the eggs he collected and the chores he was paid for, which made Maria feel something she recognized as pride so profound it was almost physical. Alina, as both her parents had suspected, was a force of nature barely contained within a small body. By the time she was 4, she had a complete and confident opinion about every subject from livestock management to the fairness of bedtime, and she expressed these opinions with a clarity and a total absence of embarrassment that made strangers blink and made Maria laugh in private, because she saw herself so plainly in it. In the fall of 1889, when Wyoming was preparing to become a state, there was a third child, another boy, whom they named Walt, and the original Walt Hargrove received this news with the same expression he had worn on all the other best occasions of the valley's life, which was the expression of a man who considered the world to be operating correctly. Young Walt was quieter than his siblings, a watcher rather than a talker, with Maria's dark eyes and a smile that arrived rarely and completely, and he had an affinity for the land that was evident almost from the beginning. The way he would sit in the garden at age 2 and put his hands in the soil with a satisfaction that needed no explanation. Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union in July of 1890, and Redstone Valley celebrated with the genuine pleasure of people who felt that statehood was something that had been earned and not simply granted. And Maria and Andrew stood in the square in front of the new courthouse and watched the flag go up. And she thought about the February morning in 1880 when she had crossed the Wyoming border in a covered wagon heading into the unknown, and about everything the unknown had turned out to contain. Ruth Peterson was standing beside her, and Ruth said quietly, "We stayed, All those years ago we both stayed and look, Maria agreed. Tom Graves gave a speech about the future of the state that was good enough to make even Walt Hargrove nod, and the Peterson children were there, and Clara Webb the schoolteacher, and the Whitlows with their own children now, and all the accumulated human fabric of a community that had built itself out of nothing and hardship and determination and occasional help from each other. And Andrew's hand found hers in the crowd, quiet and certain, the way it always did, and she held it and looked at the mountains above the valley, her mountains, the ones she had looked at every day for 10 years, and thought that some things were exactly as large as they appeared. The homestead, by 1892, when Daniel was 8 and Alina was 5 and young Walt was 3, was a working property that Maria had begun to think of in terms of the next generation. She had conversations with Daniel about it in the evenings, practical conversations about soil management and water and the economics of a mixed farming operation, and Daniel absorbed them with the earnestness of someone who understood that these were not just stories, but the structure of his future. She also had conversations with Alina about the same things, because Alina was going to know the land she would inherit equally to her brother. And when anyone suggested that this was unusual, Maria looked at them with an expression so peacefully patient that they tended not to press the point. The letter she wrote to the Cheyenne newspaper in 1892 about women's suffrage, which Wyoming had granted as a territory in 1869 and maintained at statehood in 1890, was something she thought about carefully for a week before she wrote it. She wrote about what the right to vote had meant practically in the lives of women in the territory, about the women who had run homesteads and businesses and schools and communities, about the women whose competence had built this state alongside the men's, and she signed it with her full name, Maria Easton, Redstone Valley, Wyoming. Andrew read it before she sent it, as he always did, and he said, "This is very good," and she said, "Is there anything you would change?" And he said no, and then said, "Actually, one thing. In the third paragraph, the last sentence, I think it is stronger if you say it directly instead of conditionally." She looked at it. He was right. She changed it. She had long since decided that having a person in your life who could edit your letters was one of the underrated privileges of a good marriage. The newspaper published it, and she received, over the following month, 12 letters from women around the territory, some agreeing with her and some disagreeing, and some simply saying that they had recognized something in the words and needed to say so. And she answered each of them because she thought that was the right thing to do. Corporal the Mule died in the winter of 1892, at an age that Dr. Burke, who made no claim to expertise in mules but had opinions about everything, assessed as impressively advanced. Maria went to the barn and sat with him for an hour after he went, which was not a thing she would have been able to explain to anyone who had not understood what it meant to have an animal companion through the specific loneliness of early frontier life. But Andrew understood it without explanation and left her to it, and had hot coffee waiting when she came back in. She cried, which was the first time she had cried in front of Andrew about anything, and he held her without comment until she was done and then said, simply, "He was a good mule," and she said, "He really was," and that was the whole of the memorial service, and it was exactly right. They got a new mule in the spring, a younger animal that Daniel named Brigadier on the grounds of some military history he had been reading, and Brigadier was faster and stronger and more even-tempered than Corporal had ever been. But he was not Corporal, and Maria made her peace with that the way she had made peace with most things, which was to acknowledge it plainly and then get on with what needed doing. By the mid-1890s, Redstone Valley had grown considerably from the tight-knit community of homesteaders Maria had joined. The railroad had come through, which changed the economics of everything. The school had expanded to 2 buildings and 3 teachers. New families arrived regularly, and the valley had the complex social texture of a real community with all that entailed. The disagreements and alliances, and shared projects and private dramas that made a collection of people into a place. Maria and Andrew were, by this point, among the valley's elders in the only sense that mattered, which was that they had been there longest and knew it most deeply and had the kind of history with the land and with each other that gave them a particular standing, not of authority but of rootedness. People came to them with questions, and they answered what they knew and referred the rest to those who knew better, and they contributed to the community with the same straightforward sense of obligation that they always had. Andrew served on the county water board for 3 years in the early 1890s, which he did with thoroughness and without any patience whatsoever for the political maneuvering that the board occasionally devolved into, and which he eventually resigned from with a letter to the county administrator that Maria edited twice for tone and still thought was slightly too direct, and which she submitted without a third round of edits because she thought he was fundamentally right. She continued to write to newspapers and government offices about the things she thought needed writing about, and her letters had by the mid-1890s acquired a reputation for precision and force that meant they were read and responded to rather than filed, which was the practical definition of effective advocacy. She wrote about water rights and school funding and the conditions of indigenous communities and the economic pressures on small farms, and she always signed her name, and she was never intimidated by the size of the institution she was addressing, which was a quality she had come to understand was, in fact, a form of the bravery that Andrew had described on a July boardwalk in 1883. In 1895, when Daniel was 11 and had the long-limbed serious look of a boy growing rapidly toward the person he would be, he asked his father one evening at dinner what it had been like when he first came to Wyoming. Andrew looked at the question and then at Maria, with the faint smile that was always there when he was about to say something he had thought carefully about. "Cold," he said. "February cold, and I did not know anyone and did not know the land. So I went to the neighbor who had been there longest and asked for help. 'Mama,' Daniel said. 'Your mama,' Andrew said. She told me to give her 10 minutes to get her coat, and she came out in 10 minutes exactly, and she knew exactly what to do, and I thought, this is the person to know in this valley. This is the person who understands how things work here.' 'That is when you fell in love with her?' Daniel asked, with the direct and slightly alarming perception of children. Andrew and Maria looked at each other across the dinner table with their 3 children between them and all the years between February 1883 and this evening, and she saw in his face every specific thing she knew of him, the dark past and the clean departure and the fence posts and the lambing ewes and the boardwalk and the July declaration and every morning since. 'It started then,' Andrew said. 'Yes. It took him a while to mention it,' Maria said. 'He was being restrained,' Alina said, with the authority of a 5-year-old who had been listening carefully to every adult conversation in the house for her entire life. 'Somewhat,' Maria agreed. 'Yes.' That night after the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the Wyoming evening was laying the last of its light across the mountains, she and Andrew sat on the porch in the warm summer dark with their coffee and the familiar mountains and the full, deep quiet of a place that was entirely theirs. 'You know,' she said, 'I have been thinking about what you told Daniel at dinner. Have you? That I was the person to know in this valley, that you knew it from the beginning.' 'I did,' he said, 'more or less.' 'Well,' she said, looking at the mountains, 'you were the person to know. I just took somewhat longer to admit it.' He turned to look at her in the low light, and she turned to look at him, and she thought that she had been sitting beside this man for 12 years and the specific quality of his attention, the way he looked at her as though she were genuinely worth looking at, had not become ordinary. She had always supposed that the extraordinary things became ordinary over time. That was the general wisdom, and she had found, to her persistent and grateful surprise, that it was not necessarily true. 'Do you remember,' he said, 'what you told me when I proposed, on the boardwalk?' 'I told you I was not marrying you because I needed the help,' she said. 'Because you were in love with me,' he said. Those were the only reasons that counted. They still are, she said. He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the way he had done in the crowd at the statehood celebration, quiet and certain and entirely without ceremony. And she held it and looked at the stars above Wyoming, which were as extravagant as they had always been, and which she had been looking at for 15 years and which still, on the right evening, made her feel the full size of the world and her place in it. I would like sometime, she said, to write it all down, the whole of it from the beginning. For who, he said. She looked toward the house where 3 sleeping children occupied the rooms they had built together. For them, she said, so they know what was here before they were. They will want to know, he said. Daniel already does, she said. Eleanor will demand it eventually. Walt will read it quietly and then have questions you cannot imagine. He laughed, which was a sound she had loved for 12 years and continued to find entirely necessary. You know them, he said. We know them, she said. They sat on the porch in the Wyoming night, and the mountains held their shape in the dark against the stars, and the valley around them was as real and present and full as anything Maria Townsend had ever built or believed in or fought for or loved. And she thought that the story of a life was not the dramatic moments, though those were there, the fires and the legal battles and the winter storms and the births, but was also, and perhaps more truly, all of this, the ordinary presence of an extraordinary thing. The continued daily fact of having stayed and built and loved and been known. She was 41 years old in the summer of 1897, and the homestead was 30 years from its founding, and the mountains had not changed and the sky had not changed, and the man beside her had the same angular, honest face he had had on the February morning when he came to her gate and waited to be invited through. Brave, she said quietly to the evening. What? Andrew said. You said to Walt Hargrove that first summer that I was brave. I sat down on a barrel outside the store. I know, he said. Walt reminded me of it last month. She turned to look at him. Walt told you I overheard you. Walt tells me everything I need to know, Andrew said with perfect equanimity. She laughed, and the sound of it went out into the Wyoming night, and the mountains took it in the way they took everything, patient and large and entirely unremarkable about the small human lives conducted at their feet. And she thought this was exactly correct, that a life should be unremarkable to mountains, because mountains were old and lives were short, and the only thing that made a short life remarkable was the quality of attention you brought to its particular hours, and she had been paying attention, all of it. Every fence post and lambing ewe and legal brief and barrel and boardwalk and barn and breakfast and bedtime and long evening conversation and coffee cup and ledger and letter and child's face and July sky. She had paid attention to all of it, and it had been enough, and it had been more than enough, and it was still going. Walt Hargrove, she said, is a national treasure. He would agree, Andrew said. He would phrase it more modestly, but he would absolutely agree. She leaned against her husband's shoulder in the summer dark and listened to the valley breathing around them. And she thought, as she sometimes did in the last clear moments of a good day, of the woman she had been in 1880, crossing into an unknown territory with grief and fear and $200 sewn into her coat and an absolute refusal to turn around. She had never looked back. She had never regretted staying. And now the territory was a state and the homestead was a family and the family was a life and the life was this, all of it, the whole long living chain of it, from February snow to summer stars, from a stranger at a gate to a husband on a porch, from alone to together in the deepest and most permanent meaning of that word. She was the bravest woman in the valley. She had always been. Not because she was never afraid, but because she had understood from the beginning, even before she had the words for it, that the only way to live a life that meant something was to go forward into it, all of it. The uncertainty and the grief and the hard winters and the legal battles and the love that arrived without warning at your gate one February morning and waited, quietly and without impatience, to be invited in. She had invited it in. That was all. She had said yes to the life that was offered, and she had built it with her hands and her mind and her heart, and it had become this, the best possible version of everything it could have been. "I love you," she said, to the dark and the mountains and the man beside her and the children inside and the valley that was hers. "I love you," Andrew said, and meant it the same way he had meant every word he had ever said to her, which was completely and without reservation, and with the full weight of a man who knew exactly what he was saying. The Wyoming night settled around them, and the stars continued their patient work overhead, and the mountains kept their ancient watch, and in the house behind them, 3 children slept the sound sleep of children who have never known a moment when they were not loved and cared for and held within the long arms of a life built with intention and courage and fierce, uncompromising devotion to the truth of things. Maria Easton sat on her porch in the best year of her best life and thought that she had done, in the end, the most important thing a person could do. She had stayed.